speaking of EMI, of course, the studio at that time, we know it will have its name changed for all time thanks to a certain album that we may or may not mention tonight.
We'll see if we get to it.
We might. We're going to start at the beginning, of course. But EMI Studios had been the home of EMI's recording outfit since 1931. You can see one of the older shots when it was EMI Recording Studios. The irony, and there are lots of ironies in the Beatles story, is they do not begin the Abbey Road album at the studio that will bear its name. They will not begin in Studio 2, where so much of the magic happened over the course of their career, but instead they will begin at other studios, which is a shame because while they were gone, a new system was installed.
Yes, the famous TG12345. So they had been using a mixer built at EMI called the Red 51 for most of their career, and it was very limited. We could do Sgt. Pepper, but now that we were using 8-track recording, 8 bands on a piece of tape, and stereo, which wasn't a big deal in the mid-'60s, but now everyone was listening in stereo, and all the other studios were getting these fancy mixers, they knew it was time for a change. And TG stands for the Gramophone Company, which was EMI's original company that made all their hardware, right?
Correct.
And their hardware began with 1, 2, 3, and this happened to be the next one in the sequence, the 45. And
it was they didn't make that up. It really happened that way.
It really happened. And without going into a lot of detail, it had a lot more power. It had controls on 24 different channels, so you could have a lot more microphones and a lot more individual control, and it gave a lot more flexibility. So and by the way, went from vacuum tube mixers, which they had been using, this was a transistor solid-state mixer. So it had a different sound that, by the way, Jeff Emmerich didn't really like that much.
Not at first.
Yeah. So if you've ever thought Abbey Road sounds different than other Beatles albums, it's because largely of this mixer. They had a lot more control, and so even before the recent remix, it had a very different sound and a very different quality than previous Beatles albums.
Yeah, it was warmer, brighter. In fact, a lot of fans noticed, some of you perhaps, when they first bought that record, and any fan today who listens to this in comparison to the other albums notices very quickly it has this warmer, brighter sound, and actually better separation of the instruments because of the reasons that Scott had described. Well, they start the sessions on February 22nd, 1969, and in this case, Glenn Johns is there, George Martin's there, and they begin with, as was their practice, a John Lennon song. Almost every Beatles album begins with the John Lennon track. Not the first track on the album, but the first track they recorded. Tomorrow Never Knows for Revolver. Strawberry Fields Forever for the sessions that would eventually become Sgt. Pepper, right? Revolution 1 for the White Album, and now I Want You, She's So Heavy.
Right. One of the most lyrically complex songs that John Lennon ever wrote, right? I want you so bad. She's so heavy. And he has this great quote where he says, when you're drowning, you don't say, I would really like if someone would please help me recover from this water that I'm drowning in. You just scream. And this was John screaming his love for Yoko, the song, I Want You.
They would move later, on May 6, 1969, to Olympic Studios, which you see here, where the Rolling Stones recorded. And the attraction for them with these two studios was that they were 8-track.
That's right. They were still wrestling with 8-track at EMI. And also, I think the studios were funkier. They were newer studios. EMI was still a stodgy old studio.
And very importantly, they were independent studios.
Right.
So Trident and Olympic were places where bands who were maybe a little more crunchy and a little more independent would go. And of course, the Rolling Stones thought they were like that despite their record contract. And EMI really only handled EMI artists at that time. One of the reasons Ken Townsend will rename it Abbey Road Studios in the 70s is because then other artists would feel more comfortable coming into the studio from other labels, you know, whether it be Decca or, you know, whomever. And that would allow them, of course, then to have greater revenue, which by that point, EMI sorely needed.
Yes. So one of the, if you put the album on for the very first time, how many people bought the album in 1960? Oh, you're going to show your age here. How many bought the album in 69? Right. So if you put that needle on the very beginning of Come Together, you heard the results of this new mixer because the drum and bass of Paul and Ringo just popped out. And it was a groove, I think, unlike anything the Beatles had done before, right? That was so funky, so swampy, you know, so different than
smoky.
Yes.
I'm like a synonym finder. It was very much like that. And it wasn't like the song that was originally rehearsed, of course.
Right, that's right. So should we talk about that very briefly?
I think we should. So
okay.
it comes from Chuck Berry's "You Can't Catch Me," one of their favorite targets for musical theft, as we'll talk about more than once in this presentation tonight. Of course, the Beatles, as Paul McCartney called them, were plagiarists extraordinaires.
The best knickers in the business.
That's
they
right.
nicked from everybody.
And great artists do that. One of the problems was, though, when John brought in Come Together to work on in the studio, he still had a little bit too much Chuck Berry in it. And it was Paul McCartney who said, let's slow this down a little. So by take 5, anybody bought the new remix? Yeah, by take 5, you can hear John trying out the lyrics on that slower, swampier version.